Hi, Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining me on Commonplace today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Katie.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm really excited to talk about your work today. But if you could just start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your current projects.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ben Saltzman. I teach at the University of Chicago in the Department of English. And I've just published a book entitled Turning Away, The Poetics of an Ancient Gesture. And it's about the gesture of covering one's eyes or averting one's gaze or raising one's hands to one's face as it occurs in art and poetry and philosophy from antiquity to the present, and thinking about how this gesture makes meaning in such a wide variety of ways.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of those I think that it sounds obscure at first, but then when you think about it and you look around you, you really see it everywhere, especially in our modern day. I mean, making that ancient connection is so current now, isn't it?
And I mean that was completely the experience of writing the book, was the experience of first noticing this gesture in a medieval manuscript, and we can talk about that a little bit if you're interested, but and then beginning to see it everywhere around us. And I think that's one of the things that happens when you begin to notice this gesture is you can't stop seeing it. You walk into an art museum and you see it in works of art that you've looked at a million times but have never noticed that person in a corner who is covering their face.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, we'll look into that a bit later, but it is
Yeah.
just as much about the person averting their gaze as much as how we perceive it and how we're judging them for it.
Yeah.
So, what sort of first sparked your interest in sort of poetry and visual culture as a means of sort of accessing these bigger questions about humanity and culture?
Yeah, so I mean, I trained as a scholar of early medieval England, of Old English poetry and literature and law and spirituality and monastic life, and so my first book was about secrecy in early medieval England, and then as I began, and again we can talk about kind of how this book started in a moment, but as I began to work on this project, I was really led by the materials and the conversations I was having with friends and colleagues. So much of this book was created through those conversations and that kind of community around me, community of scholars and friends who would point me in directions or tell me about examples that I didn't previously know about or hadn't thought about in this way. And so as that grew, I sort of had to learn new things, and that's one of the privileges of being a scholar these days, is that you can kind of pursue those interests, pursue one's curiosity, and discover new things along the way. So really, I'm always kind of guided by the project that I'm working on, and in this case, it was drawing me in the direction of visual culture heavily, because it's where I think we see this gesture most frequently, but also by the kinds of courses that I teach. For instance, I teach regularly a kind of introduction to poetry course for first year undergraduate students. And in that course, we read a really wide range of poetry from across the ages and across geographies and regions. And that experience of teaching that material has also influenced how I approach poetry, but also the kind of range of materials that I feel comfortable and interested in engaging with. So it's a move. I guess the story is a move from a very particular focus on Old English poetry, which is where my training is, and then kind of broadening outward because of the inspiration I've gotten from my students and friends and colleagues. So.
What's great about sort of your focus, I think, is it doesn't fit neatly into a sort of historical category. I mean, you could say history of emotions, but I think because you're being led by a gesture rather than an emotion, it allows you to sort of feed into so many other things. You're not necessarily saying this is what they are feeling, you're saying this is what they're doing, and what does that mean?
Yeah, that's kind of the problem with the book, right? The challenge with the book, both in writing it, but also in fitting it into a field, into a category, because it crosses so many different fields, both large fields like poetics or art history, but also these kind of more particular narrow, let's say like tightly focused fields like the history of emotions. And so, yeah, my hope is that it engages with those fields, I've certainly learned a lot from those fields, but then it has been really exciting to bring them into conversation with one another, and to cross the boundaries. The problem is when you remove boundaries, the question is, where do you stop?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part.
Yeah, exactly. It's something very big and very small at the same time. I mean, this gesture in and of itself. But I mean, you kind of touched on this. So, but what was it? Was there a certain image that sparked your idea for this book, and why did you think it was important to write it right now?
Yeah. So, I mean, what started the project was back in 2014 or so. I was finishing my PhD at UC Berkeley and was asked to contribute to a conference panel in honor of my dissertation supervisor, Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe, who had written so with this prompt, I decided to go back and look at her dissertation from years ago, and at the University of Pennsylvania, and I looked it up, and it was about the Book of Genesis in early medieval England, and I thought, okay, let me take inspiration from this, and so I started looking through this famous, beautiful, incredible manuscript known as the Junius manuscript, which is currently held at Oxford's Bodleian Library, manuscript Junius 11. And it contains these poetic translations into Old English from the Book of Genesis, the Book of Exodus, and other biblical texts. And it translates them into Old English verse, but it also includes these remarkable drawings, these illustrations. It's heavily illustrated, almost a kind of, this is a rough estimate, like 1-to-1, right? You turn the page, there's an illustration. You turn the next page, there's text, there's some more illustration. And so there's so much kind of an unusual quantity of visual material in this manuscript. And as I was looking through these drawings, I noticed that there are these recurrent images of Adam and Eve, corresponding with the moment in the Book of Genesis describing the fall, where Adam and Eve are covering their faces with their hands. And I thought, God, that's strange. They're not only covering their genitals, but they're also covering their faces. Why? What does this mean? Why is the artist giving them this gesture? And there are all kinds of interesting things about the way that this gesture is used in this particular moment, the way that it corresponds to details in the text. So the artist was actually reading the poetry and kind of extrapolating from that in order to come up with the kind of visual representation. And then it also echoes into other, not directly inspiring, but other forms of this gesture in the representation of Adam and Eve over the longer history. So you might be thinking, for instance, of the famous Masaccio fresco in Florence, where Adam and Eve are being expelled from paradise, and Adam has his hand sinking into his, or rather his head sinking into his hand. And so then I began. From there, I kind of wrote a kind of tightly focused essay on these drawings. But then from there was that experience of beginning to then notice the gesture everywhere, and trying to pick up the different meanings that are attributed to it, right? So in some cases, it's a gesture that signifies grief. In other cases, it's a gesture that signifies shame. In other cases, it's disgust or remorse or regret or even respect. Right, and we can go on and we can talk about some of these, but there are so many different potential meanings that can be carried by this gesture. And I saw many of them kind of at play in this moment, where Adam and Eve are being represented as it's a moment where they've suddenly gained knowledge, right? They've eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Their eyes have been opened, and with that knowledge, with their eyes now opened, they need a way to cover them, right? They need a way to shield themselves from the immense amount of not just information, but pain, suffering, the anticipation of death, shame, the recognition of their own sexualized bodies. They need a way to kind of manage that visual input. And so here they are covering their eyes. But of course, in this image, they're kind of covering their eyes, but their fingers are kind of widely spread. And so it almost appears as though they can see through their fingers, as though they're trying not to look, but they're still looking. And so those kinds of questions really permeate the book and permeate the questions that I ask of these gestures across history.
I mean, the Adam and Eve sort of example is so good for this subject, particularly because it's sort of pointing out that they've already seen the thing that they're turning away from. And it's almost like Pandora's box, isn't it? Like she's let out the evils, but she wants to close the box again, but she's already, done it. There's no going back. So I guess it's that tension for a biblical kind of Christian audience, is that it's almost like a warning for other people, isn't it? A sort of almost performative. You're going to see evil, but, and you're going to try to gain the knowledge that you want to, but you really should try and restrain yourself. It's that tension there.
Yeah, but I think you've put your finger on exactly, one of the really fascinating, complex problems around this gesture, which is, as you said, once, and we can all think about this ourselves, like our listeners can think about our own experiences of turning away or covering our eyes or closing our eyes because we don't want to see something, because we're maybe afraid of how it might affect us, or we know it might affect us in a particular way. But almost always, right, that gesture, the act of looking away, it comes too late, right? We've already seen the thing that we're trying to turn away from, or at the very least, we've anticipated it. And in anticipating it or in seeing it, turning away doesn't get rid of, or covering our eyes doesn't get rid of the thing that we're trying not to see. It still has affected us, in fact, all the more so. And I would even say that in that move to cover one's eyes or close one's eyes in response to something that we don't want to see, that's a very kind of human response, but it's a way that it signals to us like, oh, this is something that affects us. It's something that I need to kind of paying attention to isn't the right word for it, but it's something that I need to attend to. It's something that I need to engage with, or I'm being forced to engage with. And this impulse or performance, as you said, right? It's hard to tell the difference. Am I kind of reflexively turning away out of sort of without willing it, right? Or am I performing a turning away because I think that other people around me might expect me to turn away, or might think that that's what I should do, and so therefore I perform an act of covering my eyes or turning away or not looking at the scene of a car crash or something like that. And so there's a very fuzzy relationship between those two things, but in any case, we've already seen the thing. And so that question, I think, has also been really a very surprising kind of realization in writing this book. Is like, oh wow, it doesn't get rid of the thing that we've tried to avoid seeing. And so then what does it mean? What is the purpose of this gesture? Why do we do it? Why do artists put it in works of art with illustrating figures turning away or covering their eyes?
Well, obviously we're reinterpreting these reasons, sort of, going through the centuries. But how did people in the ancient world perceive it? Was it a negative or a positive thing for them compared to how we look back on these images?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing I want to do is, this is a book that goes from Plato, goes from antiquity to the present day. I hesitate to look back on the past and say that they had it right. They had a kind of it was like a golden age of attention, or where they kind of managed it correctly, and we should somehow return to that. But I'm more interested in how, what we notice about ourselves when we look back on the past. I'll tell you a kind of moment from Plato's Republic that I spend some time on in the book, but what does paying attention to that moment in Plato's Republic tell us about what does it make us ask of ourselves? And so that moment in Plato's Republic that I keep alluding to is a moment in the text where Socrates is trying to explain the division of the soul into three parts. And the reason he has to divide the soul into three parts is because if the soul were a single entity, you couldn't explain those moments where we sort of do two things at once or feel two things at once or are driven in opposite directions, right? And so how do we explain those moments where we're kind of torn within ourselves? And he gives the soul these three parts, and in order to kind of exemplify this, he tells the story of Leontius, who is walking along one day and encounters a pile of corpses next to an executioner. And he notices this pile of corpses, and then he turns away, and then he covers his face as he struggles with himself. He kind of undergoes an internal struggle, and then eventually he gives in and forces his eyes open and looks at these bodies, and he then yells at his own eyes. He condemns his own eyes, and he says, "Take your fill of this beautiful sight." And it's not clear that Socrates is, people argue about this and have different kind of views, but it's not clear that Socrates, or Plato for that matter, are like trying to articulate that one mode of relating to these corpses is the correct way, right? That Leontius should be looking at them, or he should be not looking at them, right? Like, it's not clear what the correct way of the kind of morally correct attitude to these corpses might be. But one thing is clear is that Leontius, for Socrates in this moment, is exemplifying a kind of torn soul, where the harmony of the soul is disrupted, right? Because he's going through this internal struggle. And I think the reason why it resonates so much, and this is a scene this is a moment in the Republic that really does resonate. It gets picked up, for instance, there's a famous book by Philip Gorovitch about the Rwandan. He was a New Yorker journalist, wrote a famous book about the Rwandan genocide. We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed along with our families. And at the opening of this book, he uses this passage as the epigraph, and he reflects on the experience of seeing so many murdered bodies, right? Dead bodies. And what is that experience like? And what is our own conflict in relation to those bodies? And I think it speaks to that tension that we have in ourselves, where we are driven to look, but we feel like we shouldn't look, but we don't want to look, but we're torn, and therefore we need to turn inwards and reflect a little bit, and eventually we give in, maybe we don't. But that ancient moment, right, resonates with us today. And I think when we take the opportunity to think about our own experiences in relation to this longer history, and the fact that sort of humans have been having this kind of experience for a very long time, that it helps us understand ourselves in the process.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you think about the sort of Homeric writings, they had this sort of innate fascination with death and suffering and how different characters reacted to it, didn't they? They weren't afraid of facing that and putting those questions to the reader.
Yeah. I mean, and I would say, in different ways, neither do we. I mean, we take many of us, I think, take a lot of pleasure in watching films, for instance, that are gruesome or difficult to watch, or television shows that take place in ERs, right? Yeah. It's like, and watching physicians work really hard and deal with the stresses and the gore and the blood and the death. Like, we consume that as entertainment. And part of that is an awareness of it, the kind of fictionality, but we're also aware, for instance, of, there's a range, right? But like aware of the way that a show, I don't know, do you...
I think it's wanting...
Yeah,
it's wanting to kind of experience big emotions, almost practice how you deal with them in the real world. It sort of gives you an outlet, I think, for other people's emotions, in different ways. It allows you to feel a lot, doesn't it? And process things in an odd way, fiction.
Yeah, and that's interesting to think about it as a kind of training. training for your emotions.
You take one particular example from the ancient world. I think you've used it as the cover, which is Timanthes' depiction of Agamemnon at the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia. So why do you think that this in particular sort of speaks to ancient and modern audiences as a sort of a summing up basically of the complexity of turning away? And what did they think about it, in the ancient world?
Yeah, that's such a incredible image, and it's a famous image, although the original doesn't survive, which I just love, right? That you can have a painting that is whose reputation exceeds itself. There's a copy or something, a work thought to be a kind of copy after this painting by Timanthes depicting the sacrifice of Iphigenia. It's actually a little bit different. The image on the cover comes from a print by Raimondi after Raphael depicting a scene from the Aeneid where it's a plague scene. And so the cover of the book actually has one of the many figures in this scene who is just repulsed by the death and the kind of plague around them. And so she's kind of covered. She's like turning away and turning her head and pushing away. And one of the amazing things about that print that I think actually I haven't really thought about it in these terms before, but your question, the framing of your question has prompted it. But one of the things about that print is it represents a kind of variety of responses to the suffering around us. Some people are caring for others. Some people they're sort of they're cloaked in their own world, meaning they've kind of covered their faces and they're bowing their heads into their own world. They can't deal with the world around them, the suffering around them, and that reflects an aspect of this famous painting by Timanthes in which Agamemnon is depicted alongside his daughter as she's being carried off to be sacrificed. And there are other figures around who also kind of cannot look, but they're looking in different directions. Their attitude is different. But what makes Agamemnon special in this painting, and what makes, therefore, this painting so famous, is that Agamemnon is depicted completely covering his face. And early Roman rhetoricians talked about this painting, and they referred to this painting. They sort of posed the question of, well, why did the artist, why did Timanthes cover Agamemnon's face? And the answer in these early responses, the answer that they came up with was simply that the paintbrush would have been inadequate to the task of representing such an extreme state of grief, the father's grief, such an extreme state of emotion, that there was no choice, that the artist had no choice but to cover his face, right? He couldn't depict it in an expressive form. And this is not this gets taken up in later readers, later critics. Viewers would say, he's just a bad artist, right? Like if he had any skill, he could have represented his face. He could have drawn Agamemnon's face. But nonetheless, right from the start, the reason I think this painting is so influential is because it uses this gesture to get at a really wide range of meanings, and it runs up against the limits of representation, right? It's a kind of tool, a formal tool that an artist can use when they can't draw such an extreme state of, say, emotion. And so that, from the start, it's kind of, I start the book with this painting because it poses a problem for the book, right? Then how do you read meaning into this gesture like we often do, when right from the start it resists meaning, it resists interpretation, and it can mean so many different things.
Yeah, it's like automatically making it universal, his emotion, isn't it? Because you were allowed to project how you would feel in that situation onto him.
Exactly, and that's how Cicero and Quintilian, that's how they responded to this. They said it puts the burden on the viewer of the work of art to imagine what that must feel like. And that's a very powerful and compelling argument. I think.
Yeah, it kind of means that you can't mentally turn away from the painting because you're forced to engage with it like that.
And it in many cases, I think these gestures, whether we're aware of them or not, they provoke us to reflect on our own relation to the painting. Here I am looking at this painting while figures within the work of art cannot bear to look. So what does it mean for me to be standing before this painting in an air-conditioned museum or
Exactly.
in a glorious room, right? What does that mean? And that reflection, I think, is it's crucial. And it also does something. So one of the to kind of take it from the ancient to the more contemporary, there's this photograph by Susan Masilas taken in I think 1979, and she was doing kind of photojournalism in Nicaragua during the revolution, and it's this photograph where the caption tells us that the scene is one of neighbors looking at their neighbors, basically their corpses being burned in the street, protesters being burned, their bodies being burned. But you don't see those bodies. What you see is 5 or so women responding, right? So they're each kind of holding their faces in different ways. Some are covering their eyes, some are covering their mouth, some are covering, right? And they each have a different kind of expressive response. And I think like that Agamemnon, the Sacrifice of Iphigenia by Timanthes, like the Raimondi print depicting the plague scene, it's really about the varieties of response. And in that photograph by Susan Masilas depicting that scene in Nicaragua, you get a sense of the weight of that scene without actually seeing the thing that they're responding to. You get it through their gestures, you get it through their expressions, and you feel it with them, and it's quite powerful.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's very internal emotions that it's depicting, but can you say what sort of other reasons people were turning away for in the sources that you used, apart from grief and sort of disbelief?
Yeah. There's all kinds of reasons, and that's kind of the interesting thing about this gesture. I think it tends to correspond with negative affects. So again, you mentioned grief, shame, remorse, disgust, fear, anger a little bit, but probably less so. But then it also has these, this is a gesture that can also signify respect. It's a gesture that sometimes we make sort of in embarrassment, but in moments of laughter. It's a gesture that gets used in play, especially by children. Covering their eyes is it's a way of playing. And then there's also a kind of secondary level where it's a gesture that can be used in a work of art, for instance, by an artist to formally signify something other than the emotion of the person who is making this gesture. And what I mean by it, I'll give you an example, and maybe this will make more sense, but it can be used to signify something like the experience of ambient darkness, right? So if an artist wants to represent darkness, one way to do this is to depict a figure covering their face. Because you can see the kind of logical extension. They're covering their face, therefore they're inhabiting a kind of internal experience of darkness, but then it expands outward. And where we see this most influentially is in the medieval representations of the crucifixion, right? So at Christ's crucifixion, the gospel tells us that there was a kind of eclipse, darkness covered the earth at that moment of his death. And how early artists represented this. Later artists would kind of depict Christ against a dark blue, dark black background, kind of literally representing the darkness. But early medieval artists would represent it with two figures kind of ensconced in circles representing the sun and the moon. And those figures, personified figures, would be covering their faces with their hands or with their cloaks, and they are sitting above Christ. It's indicating, right? It's a way for us to know, okay, there is darkness at this moment because those two figures are covering their faces with their hands. And we see this in like a kind of really interesting ways. So, for instance, I mentioned the Junius manuscript at Oxford's Bodleian Library. Well, the way that the artist represented that initial moment in the book of Genesis before light has been created, the moment when darkness is covering the face of the abyss. How did the artist represent this visually? Represented it with a kind of angel sitting above a kind of water-like globe, covering their face with their cloak, right? So completely covering themselves. That's a way to indicate formally that this is a moment of darkness. There are other kind of similar modes, like, for instance, it gets used as a way to represent spiritual blindness or the impossibility or difficulty of human encounters with the divine, or the inaccessibility of the divine. How do you represent that while also kind of visually depicting, say, Christ or God? How do you represent that depiction of Christ is invisible to those people within the work of art? You have them covering their faces. So it indicates something about the relationship between humans and God. So that should give you a kind of sense of there's more, but that's kind of the range of meanings that we might find in this gesture. And it's often, and it fluctuates. It's often difficult to tell, and it's often multiple meanings at once. And that's what I love about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about it beyond the emotion, really, that it's depicting, the darkness you may not be able to see, but it might be moral or spiritual, and so it's such an effective way of depicting that, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'd like to sort of touch on how this has changed sort of going into our modern day, if that's okay. So I think that sort of since the Second World War, definitely our perception of what we should, think about and turn towards has changed a lot, with sort of the narrative of never again, and this commitment to paying attention to things so that history doesn't repeat itself. I think we see this a lot in sort of the publication of like first-hand accounts of the Holocaust, and people wanting to engage with these things firsthand and really understand and feel for people. But how do you think that turning away has changed in the second half of the 20th century?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that since the end of World War II in particular, the discourse around the importance of collective attention has become really entrenched in the way that we think about our moral responsibility, our relation to atrocity, especially atrocity at great distances, right? And so on the one hand, right, our collective attention is, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, right, is one of the few guardrails against atrocity and corruption and injustice, right? We kind of have to devote our attention to these things. Otherwise, right, we can only imagine what the world would look like if we all became indifferent to them. What kinds of things bad actors could get away with. On the other hand, we can't, we're there's a way in which that rhetoric has reached a kind of point of collapse almost, where there's so much for us to pay attention to, so much that we need to pay attention to, that we can't possibly pay attention to it all. And so that kind of message has reached a point where, especially today in this moment, the kind of social media-rich moment where we encounter various forms of suffering or atrocity or injustice, big and small, on our phones, in our pockets, at every hour of the day. How do we respond to those encounters? And I think that there's a very real risk that when I talk to people, what I hear is that more and more people feel overwhelmed by this, feel like their attention doesn't do anything, and are kind of descending into a state of indifference, a sort of shrugging of the shoulders. Well, I can't do anything. What is the purpose of me paying attention? I'm just going to scroll past it, or I'm going to not pay attention. And as I've thought about this, I've come to understand sort of indifference as the real problem, right? That like the danger of becoming a society that is indifferent, that seems to me as a very dangerous situation. But on the other hand, and so how do we not descend into kind of moral paralysis, right? How do we not descend into that kind of hopelessness? And what I've learned from studying this gesture across, wide range of works of art and through history is that artists in particular, I think, seem to have recognized that turning away, covering one's eyes, sometimes it's performed in indifference because we don't want to see or we don't care, but more often than not, it's because we are moved by something that we are seeing, because it's affecting us deeply, and it's used to represent deep engagement with the thing that we are encountering. And so again, this comes back to what we were talking about at the start of our conversation about how once you find yourself turning away, it's kind of too late. And so what I began to notice is that oftentimes when we turn away from something, if we recognize that moment, we recognize our sort of need to turn away, or the unbearability of the thing that we're seeing, that's like I think a very human signal to ourselves that this is something worth attending to, that I should pay attention to this, that I should follow it, that I should think about, my own, I should reflect on my own relation to it, and maybe then be in a position to take some kind of action to ameliorate it, or to respond in some way. But that response, that mode of empathy only becomes possible when you take a moment to stop being a mere observer, a sort of careless observer, and instead you kind of take a moment to turn away and actually reflect, feel, and then prepare some kind of response. And so I think we're at a mode where we're becoming more and more just kind of like observers without care, and there's a risk of becoming indifferent as a result of that. And so I've become curious about, well, what does it mean when we take a moment to reflect, to think, to feel?
Yeah, there's some really good reflections there, and it definitely is, it's something that is immediately relevant, your work to social media and the 24-hour news cycle, because we are exposed to a whole lot more than we're able to reflect on, but there's still that sort of individual pressure to still consume it, otherwise you're seen as not caring. But as you say, if you're turning away from something, you are turning towards something else, which could be, a really insightful reflection, and you're obviously turning away because you feel something, immense about it, like Agamemnon, really. And even if you don't have control over it, you could turn to something closer to home that, you could have a real impact as well.
Yeah, I love that, right? It is when you're turning away from one thing, you're turning towards another, and it might be turning inward to reflect. It might be, turning to a loved one to take care of someone who matters in your life. It might be turning towards your community, and it might be turning back to that scene that affected you, and letting it kind of activate you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you sort of touched on our modern attitudes and your reflections on that. Do you think that people still have agency over this gesture today? Do you think that it's more in our imagination rather than something that's depicted as the ancient world did?
Yeah, the question that's interesting. The question of agency, I think it's become more complicated, right? As our way of encounter, right? in some ways we encounter, like, what we happen to encounter in the world around us is sometimes in our control, sometimes it's not, right? Like, you turn a corner and you see something, or you encounter someone on the street, and you didn't have any control over that, but now you're facing this person, or you're facing this scene. So in some ways that's always kind of been the case, I think, but then there's this new dimension, not that new, I guess, like over the past 20 years or so, dimension where more and more our lives and our encounters with media are governed by algorithms that are kind of out of our control, and there are ways to maybe like moderate them, or kind of perceive that you have some control over them, but like really, like, what crosses our feed, what crosses our news feed, what crosses our Instagram feed, whatever, is governed by forces that we don't have much control over at all. And so that's interesting too, right? Is that it's not just about us turning away from one thing or turning towards another, but in fact, we're often being turned towards one thing or being turned towards another. And that effect on us, being affected in that way, is kind of troubling. Yeah. So it's like, how do you recuperate your own agency and turn towards things that you want to engage with or devote your attention to? How do you resist kind of being turned this way or that by media forces at large?
Yeah. I think we have to wait for that answer to that question, really, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But part of it is like, again, yeah, maybe like, taking it back, right? Taking back some of that control and choosing
realizing
where
how
we
effective it is as a choice sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before we sort of tap into your Commonplace book, is there sort of part of who you've studied, whose Commonplace book would you most like to have access to? Maybe you could find out why they were turning away in a particular image or something.
Yeah. Oh God, I was thinking about this. I don't know if I'm kind of interested in anyone's, but I guess I imagine like maybe Plato or something like, someone like that who's just so far removed from us, right? Like, where it would be really interesting to see a kind of more personal, less rhetorically crafted book or document that gives us some indication into thought and life. But then I was also thinking, I don't know, someone wild like Salvador Dali, right? Who I write about at the end and went down some rabbit holes with with him and his life, and he has this autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, and it just reading that, it's hard to tell what's fact and fiction and what it's very surreal at many moments. But yeah, someone with just a really wild life like that might be might be interesting. But maybe like, I don't know, more about Commonplace books than I do.
No, I mean, anyone can have one. Like, that's the thing. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if you have a Commonplace book. A few people I've spoken to actually have something that resembles one. But if you don't, what would it look like, sort of aesthetics wise? Oh,
yeah. I don't. I mean, and I think it has to do with my handwriting is very messy. The way that my mind works, I get very focused on like a single problem or a single project at a time, and I kind of dive into that. And so I've never, I think at moments maybe I've tried to keep notebooks and journals, but I haven't successful kept something like a Commonplace book. But I've been starting on a new project, and in the process of working on that project, one of the ideas I've had, it's about poetry and waves, and thinking about the relationship between the way that poetry works, the way that poetry moves us, and the way that waves physically work, and the way that ocean waves or waves in the sea move us, and kind of the intersection between these two phenomena. And as part of this project, I got the idea to try to like memorize a lot of the poems that I end up writing about. And it's a wide range of poetry, contemporary stuff and ancient stuff, and mixed, and thinking about the relationship between the two. And so I've started kind of trying to do that. It's very alien to me. I didn't grow up memorizing poetry, and so it's kind of a skill that I don't think I have, but I'm trying to acquire. And in the process, I've started keeping a notebook where I kind of write down as a memorization tactic, but also as a way to kind of record the poems that I'm working on, write down the poems. So that maybe is a kind of commonplace book, but I feel like it's more contained. Right? It's like more topically contained. It's more of a like notebook than a commonplace.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, yeah,
what do you think?
We'll probably get to the poems a bit later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's sort of encapsulating a time in your life, which I think it counts as a...
Yeah.
So, you've obviously sort of thought a lot about ancient philosophy, and you mentioned Plato. Maybe his Commonplace book would be in the running for you. So is there sort of a quote or philosophy that's sort of had an impact for your life?
I don't know. I have these. I am looking over at my computer monitor, and a while ago, I think it was during grad school, I typed up, using my typewriter, I typed up these note cards, and one of them says, "It's okay to do nothing," and by no means a famous philosopher. I don't know if anyone would agree with that, but I like wrote it at a time where I was like feeling compelled to constantly generate, but then I was being kind of counterproductive because I'd like spend time in front of my computer getting distracted rather than, and so I was trying to like remind myself to like, it's okay to just like sit back and do nothing. And I feel like every year that becomes more and more it like becomes better advice. It's like as we're again confronted with more and more things to do, as life becomes more and more crazy, that there's some value in pausing and trying to do nothing. I'm not very good at that. I'm like always fidgeting with something or working on something.
No, I think we all need to remind ourselves of that. But the doing nothing is probably, in the future quite useful. It isn't. It's creating ideas, allowing you to reflect on stuff, it's turning away from work. So what about a sort of photograph or a piece of art that you could put in your Commonplace book? What would that be that you'd want to keep going back to and infinitely sort of think about?
I don't know. Do you think like, so here's a question for you. I'm gonna defer.
No.
Do you think like, how are commonplace books used?
Oh.
Like, do you think that most people turn back to them and return to them, or do you think like they're there, they get kind of locked in, you've had the experience of producing the thing at that moment, and then it like sits on a shelf and you never return to it?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you?
I mean,
what do you think?
It depends on the century, I guess. I mean, if you're thinking about the 16th, 17th century, I think people wrote down sort of books and their thoughts on whilst reading the book without, noting in the margins sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, they're also unique, and I think everyone used them for a different reason, but I think it's collecting things. It's basically your phone notes app, but in physical form, I think, for people in the past. But I mean, obviously, for historians, they're invaluable, aren't they? But
yeah, that's true. I mean, I worry for historians of the future who have so, like, infinite quantity of material, like all the spam in a Gmail.
How much of it will be left as well? Like,
what?
How much of it will be left for them by that point as well?
Yeah, I mean, right, the sort of digital obsolescence. But if it is, right, like, and they recover it, right, like, famous authors.
They probably have
Gmail
AI to help them by
like,
that
what
point.
is, what do they have to wade through?
Yeah.
But no, particular work of art. It's funny. You had sent me some of these questions, and when I got to my office, I have like a stack of random kind of postcards and things like that, and I found two And one of them is, and I'll save the postcard, but one of them is this this postcard depicting Mays Land. Not just, it's a photograph from Mays Landing, which is the home of Genevieve May, who was a family friend of ours, and my mom became friends with her because she was a nurse. My mom was a nurse at UCLA, and Genevieve had opened her home. She was affiliated with UCLA through the psychology department, and she had opened her home in Malibu up to retreats. And so my mom began running these nursing retreats at Genevieve's home. And so then we kind of became family friends, and we would often go there. And I write about this a little bit at the end of Turning Away, at the end of the book. But I just this morning came across this photograph, and it's like it's a photograph that's also imprinted in my mind. I no longer need the photograph to remember what this looks like. But basically, for those who are listening, it's a doorway that opens out into a kind of brick patio with some foliage, olive trees and such, that and then overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And this was the kind of design of her home, was you sort of walked in, and the entryway was like 2 feet wide, and you immediately walk out. So you walk in and then walk out, and you're now in the kind of in the view of the Pacific. And I spent so much time just like arriving there, and the first thing I would do is kind of walk through and then stand on the cliff and look at the waves below and the ocean below, and just feel absorbed in it. So I mean, that is what Commonplace books are for, right? It's kind of like locking memories in. And maybe you return to them, maybe you don't. The physical book, that is, but those memories are always maybe there. They're somewhere.
Yeah, they're so personal. You don't need to record them, but they're there. But I think that's what's amazing. Yeah, I love that idea. It all sounds like a portal into sort of another world. A lovely thing to have. I mean, you said maybe you have a postcard as well, or is that?
Yeah, well, so then like next to it was this postcard that was sent to me by Nancy Thibault, who was a graduate student at the University of Chicago when I first arrived, and now teaches art. She's an art historian and teaches art history at Oxford. And I spent some time in Oxford a month ago or so, and got to spend some time with her. But it was nice to kind of re-encounter this postcard, and it has a photograph of a medieval ivory depicting the Ascension of Christ, and there's
thanks for giving me a hand.
It's a kind of work that she had brought to my attention when I was first working on this project, and then written kind of in handwriting on white blocks of paper overlapping the image. It says, "Thanks for giving me a hand," and it's depicting the ivory has Christ reaching out, and God is like reaching down out of the clouds and pulling him up. And there's just a very sweet note on the back, note of gratitude. And I love that this conversation prompted me to re-encounter this postcard, which is very sweet and means a lot. So.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. Yeah, it's that lovely link between the personal and work as well. I mean, probably for you, they're quite inseparable sometimes. The people who have helped you with this project. So what about music? Do you listen to music while you're working, or is there a song that uplifts you always come back to?
Oh, I'm terrible with music.
No?
I like listening to music, but I have a terrible time. And maybe this comes back to the like memorizing poetry, is that like I kind of listen to it atmospherically, ambiently, but then I don't...
what it was.
I sort of can't engage with it intellectually, or haven't developed a practice of engaging with it intellectually. And so, but I mean, maybe I could, but I think that would be a boundary. I think I don't know if I'd include music in my Commonplace.
So there's no particular genre or anything that you particularly like? Is it like you listen to classical or kind of pop?
Oh, it's so random.
Yeah, okay.
It's like,
algorithm.
Pink Pony Club on the one hand, and then like, little Harry Styles, a little classical, little jazz, little Miles
Yeah.
Davis. You know, it's like
Yeah.
it's so random. There'd be no
That's fine.
no
No.
logic to it.
I get
Yeah.
that.
You know.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So, what about? Do you want to bring up a poem from what you've been working on? One that sort of stood out to you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the first poem that I've like started memorizing is this poem, beautiful poem by Wallace Stevens, "The Idea of Order at Key West," and that has just been, it's been a real. It's kind of, I've sort of created, I guess, my own kind of like internal commonplace book in which that poem has become deeply internalized, and it's a really wonderful experience to have a poem in your mind. And be able to recount it in parts or recount it in whole, to occupy time when you're, when you might ordinarily open up your phone. You can kind of sit on the bus or go for a walk, and you can kind of recite the poem in your mind, or aloud if you want to trouble the people around you. But yeah, that's been a poem, and I've just kind of started memorizing. Far easier poem, I think, to memorize. I'm not sure maybe it's just more practice, but "The Fish" by Marianne Moore, which is interesting because it's such a formally kind of rigid poem. Each line has a certain number of syllables repeated in each stanza, and so many lines are kind of one syllable. Some lines are one syllable, and it's broken in very strange ways that don't flow. That there's a lot of enjambment, for instance, and so memorizing it visually is quite difficult. But yeah, so that's where the handwritten commonplace book or handwritten notebook comes in.
Yeah, it's another thing that it goes past the written word, really, because it occupies sort of an image in your mind of how it's formulated.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just listening to, there's a recording of Marianne Moore reading it, and so I was trying to like align myself with her voice and do things like that, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I do kind of do the same thing when I'm learning like a new song, because I classical music, but I mean, you listen to different people's interpretations of the same written text, and it's not the same song most of the time. It's got completely different emotions in it. Yeah.
True.
So what about a book that you'd like to sort of, I mean, this could be more for people looking back at your Commonplace book as a book that, you've particularly enjoyed that you'd recommend to people. Could be like a classic text, or it could be something that's influenced your work.
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. I don't know. I have a hard time with questions like this. But I think, I mean, the first thing that comes to, I think the first book that comes to mind is like one that I recently read and would have like hypothetically put into my Commonplace book. It also feels like a very Commonplace book type book. Is this it's this great recent book by Robert McFarlane entitled "Is a River Alive?" And it sort of asks this question of various rivers. So it's kind of part philosophy, part narrative, and he travels to 4 different rivers and thinks about the kinds of damage that's being done to them, and thinks about their aliveness and the relationship to the human and to himself, and the experience of traveling around or encountering these rivers and the people who live nearby or who are trying to protect them. But anyways, it's a very moving book, and beautifully written. So I don't know, again, it's not something that's like deeply influential, but I think part of your question is, and part of the kind of prompt around Commonplace books is like, so you happen to read this book, you happen to encounter it, how do you digest it, or how do you how do you take note of it? And that was just happens to be something I read recently that that I probably would have written down.
Yeah, this actually sounds like a wonderful book. Yeah. Sounds like something that can cross over quite a few sort of ways of thinking, philosophies, and also the kind of, you know, the eco side of it as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
So do you like to cook? Like, is there a family recipe or one that you've started making recently that you'd like to write down?
I love cooking.
Yeah.
I hate recipes.
Okay.
No, I cook all the time, you know, nearly every meal for our family, and then oftentimes large meals for larger groups. And I never use a recipe, and it's always, you know, even if I'm cooking the same dish, it's always a little bit different each time, and I just love that. But it frustrates those who like my partner, who, you know, well, let's reproduce this thing, let's, like, you know, reproduce the recipe, or I want to be able to reproduce it when you're not here, or something like that. And it's just, I, you know, can give the gist of it.
Yes.
But I often, you know, you asked about pictures or drawings or you know, photographs, but I often, you know, if I do use a recipe book, and like we have a great collection of recipe books, but I often just use the picture as inspiration, right?
Yeah.
I'll see the final thing and then I'll make it.
Well, that's the sign of a great chef, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got that much experience that you can do it from an image.
I mean, it sometimes turns out different, but
well,
that's
yeah.
okay. Do you cook as well?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I love cooking. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Do you
I'm
use
kind of the
recipes?
same.
What's a good-
I actually kind of do it. I use a lot of, you know, when you see people making stuff on Instagram or something,
Yeah.
I do prefer that to a written recipe, because I don't like following like strict instructions. I find it a bit annoying.
I find it so
like, 'cause
stressful.
you know what you want, and
Yeah.
you've got different preferences, and you just kind of eyeball things. So yeah, I'm kind of the same like that.
Exactly.
I get that.
Exactly.
So kind of the penultimate question before a wild card, where you can choose anything you want, is what's sort of looking forward and backwards? What's something you're grateful for right now, and what's something that you want to achieve by this time next year?
Ooh, these are great questions. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for so much. You know, the privilege of being able to write and think, and you know, there's just family, being able to be in the water when I can be in the water. It's like all of these things combined, but just for the immense amount of privilege to be able to do the work that I do and teach the students that I do, I'd say is a primary one. And then for the future, more conversations like this, and more conversations with friends and colleagues. I find them so inspiring, and you know, that's I just hope that continues.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So what about the wild card? Anything. It can be like a pressed flower, another poem, sketch, or just like an anecdote from a conversation, one maybe that you've had with a friend.
I don't know. It's tricky. I mean, maybe I don't know, some way to like capture I have two youngish, now that, I mean, they're not that young anymore, children, they're 8 and 11, like some way to capture that. If there was some like magical way I guess photographs do that, but not, you know what I mean.
The essence.
Right? Like the essence of this moment, right? That would be pretty sweet.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I've absolutely loved this chat, and it's been very kind of enriching for me as well, to hear about your work and how it links into your life. I think you're doing great things, so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you, and I'll add to the gratitude list how grateful I am to be here, and that you included me on your project.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure. I mean, I look forward to seeing what you do next with this kind of thing, because it seems to have linked so neatly with everything that's going on in the world, and gives us a lot to think about. So,
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Benjamin.
All right. Take care.